Thank you, Sandy. And welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us this afternoon. And we have members from California. We also have members from across the country who have tuned into this very special webinar that we're having tonight. Usually our webinars feature our California members, but tonight we are featuring two women from Philadelphia who are going to give us all the tips for how to become a member of a board of a nonprofit organization. So we're really, really happy to have them, and it's a special treat. This wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been able to Zoom. They didn't have to fly to California and get a hotel and wait for us to talk to them. We can just talk to them from Philadelphia. So that's a special treat. I always try to look for the silver lining in things like COVID, and this probably is the only one I could find so far. This is one of the silver linings, is that we can have people from Philadelphia join us. So let me introduce our two speakers for tonight. Dr. Vicki Kramer is a consultant to nonprofits and a former academic. She was the lead author of the seminal report, Ethical Mass on Corporate Boards: Why 3 or More Women Enhance Governance, initially published in 2006 by Wellesley Centers for Women. She was also the founding president of the 30% Coalition, a national collaboration of corporations, professional firms, institutional investors, and nonprofits working to reach 30% women across public company boards on the way to parity. Also with us tonight is Dr. Carolyn Adams. She's a former dean of the College of Liberal Arts and president of the Faculty Senate from Temple University. She's a professor emeritus with over 30 years college teaching experience. Her books and articles have focused on nonprofit organizations, including universities and health systems. She has served as a director of the William Penn Foundation and trustee of Moore College of Art and Design. Both Dr. Kramer and Dr. Adams are founding members of the Women's Nonprofit Leadership Initiative, a group of Philadelphia area women leaders in the nonprofit sector that has been working since 2012 to increase the percentage of women on the governing boards of nonprofit healthcare and higher education institutions. They've co-authored a national report, Increasing Gender Diversity on the Boards of Nonprofit Eds and Meds: Why and How to Do It, co-published in March 2020 by Women's Nonprofit Leadership Initiative and Nonprofit Issues. So today, welcome again, both of you. We're so happy that you can be here, and I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Kramer.
Thank you so much, Diane. Carolyn and I are just delighted to be doing this, and it really is evening in Philadelphia, although I know it isn't in California. But you're right, Zoom is a wonderful thing for joining us at different sides of the country. Tonight we're going to be, or today for you, we're going to be focusing on the findings of the research that Carolyn and I have done on the national boards of eds and meds, eds being the higher education institutions, colleges and universities, and the meds being health systems and hospitals. We have looked at the fact that there is a serious gender gap on these boards and how we can do something about it. And our most recent research, it was a national look at that and at why the numbers are what they are and how to change them. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the research that we did in conjunction with LaSalle University in Philadelphia, focusing on the Philadelphia figures, and that research preceded the national research. It seems very fitting that we are doing this webinar, and this is our first webinar on this subject, although we've written some articles that have gotten good publicity. But it's very fitting that we should be doing this first webinar for California, because as some of you may well know, California has been a leader on the issue of board diversity. You are the first state to have legislation mandating gender diversity on corporate boards, not nonprofit boards, unfortunately. And very recently, only in the last month, California has added another piece of legislation to mandate racial diversity as well. Very important that both of those things occur. Briefly, the Women's Nonprofit Leadership Initiative, and you'll see our homepage in front of you, is the group that Carolyn and I have been working with and that inspired both pieces of research that we're going to talk about. And you'll see the wonderful Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote that we only very recently added to our homepage. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception. And it's a wonderful way to remember her and link all her incredible work for women's equity to the work that the Women's Nonprofit Leadership Initiative is doing. So the reason we're focusing on eds and meds and not the entire nonprofit universe is that eds and meds are the biggest and most powerful of the nonprofits in every region and nationally. And because in a way they are the biggest and most powerful, they have the worst record of having women and people of color on their boards, because they are the kinds of boards that powerful white men want to be on. And so when you look at figures for nonprofits and you lump them all together, the picture looks much better than it looks in the eds and meds. So I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn now and have her talk to you about the specific research that we've done.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Vicki. Can we change the slide, please? Can we get the next slide? This is a slide that asks you 3 questions, and we're asking you to answer these 3 questions tonight with us with a simple yes or no. That's all we need, is a yes or no for each one of those questions on the screen in front of you. And while you're answering, I should tell you that we're guessing that the answer that you give us to at least one and maybe all 3 of these questions is going to be no, because not because you don't care about these issues. You obviously do care about higher education. That's why you're a member of AAUW, and that's why you're here tonight. But you may not know who's governing your alma mater, because frankly, it's difficult to find out exactly who's sitting on these boards. And that signals a really important point about the nonprofit colleges and universities and the health systems that we're looking at with this work, and that we're going to be discussing today. And that is that their boards don't answer directly to any outside body, like a legislature or like a group of shareholders. So they don't really provide the kind of information about themselves and about their inner workings that, for example, state universities do routinely provide. They provide that information to legislatures, and they provide that information to the public. But these are not state universities. Our research is really about the nonprofit institutions. And we have found out, as we collected data for this research that we have been doing, that some of these nonprofit institutions do provide information about who's on their board. They'll, for example, most routinely, they'll list their board members on their website. But others don't even give you that list on their website. Many only lists the names of their board members, and they don't give you any biographical information, and they don't give you information about the professional affiliations of their board members. And frankly, very few of these institutions will give you a photograph, which really helps us, of course, because we're working to establish not just the genders of board members for these institutions, but also we want ethnic and racial categories as well, if we can find them. But very few institutions really openly give you that and easily give you that information. In quite a few cases, we ended up in this research using our own professional and personal and social networks, getting to somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, so that we could obtain the information that we were looking for, because that was really the only way we could find out exactly who these folks were. Let me say right here at the outset, we don't think this is some kind of deliberate effort to disguise who's governing these institutions. It's more likely just that the leaders of these institutions see themselves as self-governing. These actually are self-governing institutions in which the boards decide whom to invite to sit on their boards whenever there's an opening or a vacancy. They decide within the board itself whom they're going to select and how they're going to make that selection. So many of them don't feel they need to provide information to the public about who governs them. And yet these are institutions that are terribly important to our social systems. They're also institutions that are really strongly supported by their tax exemptions, meaning that you and I as taxpayers support these institutions. So they really do need to be more accountable to outsiders. Okay, can I move on to the next slide? Can I get the next slide, please? This is the cover of the study that Vicki mentioned to you in her opening remarks. This is the report that we did on the nonprofit institutions in our own region of Greater Philadelphia, where we live and work. So this is a study on which we partnered with LaSalle University and their nonprofit center. They have a center which is well known and well reputed for the kind of research they do and the work that they've done with nonprofit organizations and institutions. And you may know that our region of Greater Philadelphia is kind of a center for meds and eds. Really, we have a more important proportion of our economy tied up in meds and eds than probably other East Coast cities, maybe with the exceptions of Boston and New York. But they are a very important part of not just our social systems and our social structure, but also our economy, furnishing lots of jobs and procurement and purchasing from other providers and so forth. So for this study, what we decided to do is to look at the 25 largest colleges and universities, along with the 25 largest health systems in our region. And when I say largest, I should tell you that all but 2 of these 50 institutions that we included in this research, all but 2 of them have annual revenues that exceed $100 million. So you can see that these are quite substantial institutions and organizations. Okay, can I ask for the next slide so that we can take a look at the findings here? So here is what we found for the colleges and universities in our region of Greater Philadelphia. As you can easily see, white men dominate these boards with 59% of all the seats on these boards. White women hold a little more than 1/4 of the seats, and there are many fewer seats than that held by women and men of color. 27% for white women, 8% for men of color, 5% for women of color. And I should tell you, folks, that these percentages would actually look even more lopsided in men's favor if it weren't for a number of colleges and universities that were established as women's colleges, like Bryn Mawr, for example, or Catholic institutions that have been established by orders of nuns, religious orders. These women's institutions we found had generally a much higher percentage of their seats occupied by women. So that pulled up the overall average. And incidentally, the same pattern exists for healthcare institutions. When they were founded by women, women's organizations, religious orders, or founded for women, then those boards also showed a higher proportion of seats filled by women. Okay, can I ask you for the next slide, please? So as Vicki touched on in her remarks, having seen these numbers for our own region in Greater Philadelphia, we wanted to know more about the processes that are at work inside of boards that produce the pattern that we have seen, the pattern of male dominance on these boards. So for that, we really had to consult with people who had actually sat in boardrooms, who had participated in the process of selecting board members. And so that's why the title of this particular study highlights the why and the how these boards do their work. We wanted to know from the inside, from people who had actually, who really had participated in these decisions, how those decisions got made. So to do that, we conducted 59 in-depth confidential interviews across the United States. And these were interviews mostly with women board members, but some also, a much smaller number, were with men who had served as board members, as board chairs, and even chief executives. We interviewed some presidents of institutions, both male and female. And for this sample that we interviewed, 39% of our women were women of color. So we feel pretty good about the representation of the thoughts and views of women of color in this study. The institutions, I should tell you, that we studied here included major colleges and universities. Some were Ivy League. Several had started as women's colleges, as I mentioned just a minute ago. One was a historically Black institution. Some were religiously affiliated, and they were located throughout all the regions of the United States. And I should explain here for a minute that we were concentrating here on private nonprofit institutions, colleges and universities. So these did not include the state university systems that gain a good proportion of their support from state legislatures and from taxpayers. These are strictly nonprofit institutions that must raise all of their funds privately. Okay, so on to the findings on the next slide. Can I have the next slide, please? So this table shows you the findings for 57 institutions. You'll notice that's the number, the total number in the column on the right-hand side. That number, by the way, is 2 fewer than the number of our respondents. If you heard me say a minute ago that we interviewed 59 respondents, we have here a report on 57 institutions, and that's fewer. That number is smaller only because at 2 of the institutions in our study, we interviewed 2 different respondents. We chose to interview 2 different board members. So our sample included 59 respondents, even though there were only 57 institutions. So if I can, let me draw your attention here to the top line of numbers on this table on the screen. We found that barely more than a third, you see that percentage on the top line there, 37% over on the top right-hand side of the table. So that's really very, very little more than 1/3 of our institutions had reached what most experts regard as the minimum acceptable representation of women, which is 30% women on a board, at least 30%. That minimum number, which is a kind of accepted minimum among those who study and work on this issue of representation on boards, that minimum applies to both profit-making boards of companies and also nonprofits. And so that is why the national organization that is promoting diversity among companies, private companies on their boards of directors is actually called the 30% Coalition. Now, some of you may know that governments, even national governments, have sometimes adopted that 30% figure. There are European countries, for example, like Belgium and the Netherlands, that have required companies to assign at least 30% of the seats on their boards of directors to women. Belgium and the Netherlands, for example. And then you have a country like Norway, which in 2008 required companies that are operating there in Norway to fill at least 40% of their director seats with women. Okay, we don't really expect our national government at any time soon to make such a declaration, but the message from this slide I would like you to take away is that almost 2/3 of the institutions in our study are not achieving this minimal representation of 30% of women on their boards of directors. So that's not a very positive outcome for us, and we're now going to talk a little bit more about why the numbers are so low. And for that kind of discussion, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my partner in research, Vicki Kramer. Vicki?
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. And before we go to this next slide, why the numbers are so low, before we discuss that, I just want to go back to the little poll that we took at the beginning, where Carolyn asked the questions of how many people know who's on the board of their alma mater and so on. And do we have the results of that poll? I know we had hoped to have the results of them that we could show you so that you'd have some idea how many of the, and we'd have some idea how many of you really do have an idea about your alma mater. But I take it maybe we don't have them. So if we get them somewhere along the way, maybe when we get to the question period, we can come back to that. So if we go to the next slide, then why are the numbers so low?
And Vicki, this is Tracy. Just to interrupt you a little bit. We were having a little trouble with the poll earlier, so we did not present it yet. So if it's a good time now to do it, or if you'd like to do it later, we can do that.
Sure, you can do it now.
Okay. Yeah, Sandy's having a little difficulty with her mic, so let's see if she can get it up. There it goes. So the poll is up there right now. So if you want to click your answers and click submit when you're done, then we'll present the results.
So people hadn't responded to it yet.
Correct. They haven't seen the poll because we had trouble with it. So now they're seeing it on their screen.
Oh, okay.
Give them a minute or two to respond and then submit, and then we'll get the results.
Great.
Okay, if you want to continue, we're about 40% done. So Sandy will let us know when it's ready for you.
Okay. Okay.
So go ahead. We're almost done. Go ahead, and then we'll break at another time and show the results if that's okay.
Okay. So then let's talk about why the numbers are so low of the representation of women on the boards. You'll see that we have two categories here of response. One is that women face barriers that are similar to those on for-profit corporate boards in being able to get into the boardroom, but they also face barriers that are particular to nonprofits. And so let me talk about first those that are similar to those on for-profit corporate boards. The same kinds of people sit on both boards, so it's not surprising that they would share the unconscious bias and stereotypes. If they're on one board, then they will bring the same bias and stereotypes to another kind of board. So in both the for-profit and nonprofit arena, people come with, they're not consciously saying we don't want women, but somehow their biases get in the way. And some of the stereotypes that we heard when we interviewed people and they told us what they thought was the barriers and stereotypes were, some of them were that we just can't find enough women who have the skills and experience. You know, they're just not out there. Or women just aren't that interested in being on nonprofit boards. They'd rather be on for-profit boards. And finally, and not surprisingly, women really have a lot of time pressures because they have family demands that men don't have. And so they just don't have time to be on these boards. So those are some of the stereotypes that get in the way. And then recruiting members for for-profit and nonprofit boards largely takes place among what people call the good old boy networks. So it's really who you know and who's in your social network. And so often men are in networks of other men. They play golf, they have eating clubs, and in their corporate offices, often there are, particularly at the top, very few women. And so their networks, the people they know, are made up of people like them. And they don't know the women out there who have the same credentials. We had one interview with a woman who said, and she was a very high-level executive woman, and she had been introduced to a prominent businessman in her community, and he said, "I can't believe I don't know you. We should get you on a board." So it was a perfect example of, she'd been there all along, he just didn't know her. And then what we call the mirror effect, boards appointing directors who look just like them. One of the college presidents, the women college presidents that we interviewed said, you know, people make lists and they put on those lists people who look like them because that's who they know. And they use those lists when they are asked to recommend somebody for a board. So these barriers exist in the for-profit as well as the nonprofit boards. But the one difference that's important in the for-profits is that most of the for-profits employ search firms to help them find people. And so the search firms have larger networks often, and they can find people of color and women, particularly if they're asked to do so. But in the nonprofit world, and particularly in the eds world, even though the educational institutions often use search firms for finding their higher executives, their college presidents, they never use them to find board members. We found that some of the hospitals and health systems do use search firms, but none of our eds said they use search firms. So now barriers particular to nonprofit organizations, because for-profits and nonprofit organizations do function differently in several ways. And one of the key ways is that for-profits pay their board members to be on the board, whereas nonprofits expect that their board members will pay them, will contribute. And so there are significant financial expectations and a mixing of fundraising and governance on the boards, which doesn't occur in the for-profit world. And I'm going to say more of that in a minute, but I just want to comment on also the shareholder activists. Carolyn had referred to shareholders in the for-profit world. There are no shareholders in nonprofits. Shareholder activists have been really critical in pushing the for-profits to put women on their boards and people of color. And in fact, one of those important shareholders is CalSTRS, the California State Teachers Retirement System. So retirement systems, pension funds, mutual funds have joined together across the country, and the 30% Coalition actually helped bring that about, and have exerted enormous pressure on companies to put women on their boards because they vote. And so they vote for who goes on those boards, and they can vote against the slate if the board isn't putting anybody on that doesn't look like a white male. There is no such thing in the nonprofit world. So there's no pressure from shareholder activists. So let's go to the next slide then and talk more about the financial expectations for board members. So this is, again, just in the nonprofit world and in the eds and meds. We asked our interviewees how much financial expectations figured into the picture of getting onto their boards. And you will see on that top line that there are almost 20% of the total of the eds and meds expect a standard minimum donation. And that standard minimum is not a small amount. So we heard $10,000, $25,000, and even more. So that is a screening characteristic. And it works in two ways. It works because there are many women and people of color who can't afford that. It also works because of a stereotype or an assumption that women don't have that kind of money, even though there's been a lot of research that shows that high net worth families have equal contributions coming from women and from men, from the husband and the wife. And so there are many women out there who actually could afford this. But that's an assumption that screens people out. And then we have the exceptions that are made in order sometimes to enable women and people of color. But an exception means that there's a general rule. And so the general rule is that you expect a high contribution, and you can't make many exceptions because you can't afford it. You need to bring in that money. So that's a screening factor. And it also perpetuates a stereotype, because if you only make exceptions for women and people of color, you perpetuate the view that those are the only people who, that white men can afford this and women and people of color can't. In some institutions, it's important to give up to your capacity. In some, everyone gives, but no specific amount. And you'll notice that a very small 12% say that giving is not important. And it's particularly notable that it's only one college or university said that, and 6 hospitals and health systems said that. Now, why is that the case? Well, that is the case because in numerous hospitals and health systems, they have separated governing boards from what they call foundation boards or fundraising boards. So the governing board isn't expected to do fundraising, and they don't have to care about whether people have substantial money to give in coming on their board. So this is an important difference between eds and meds, as well as between the nonprofits and the for-profits. The other important thing is that in the recruiting process, often the development office of your alma mater gives a list of potential candidates to the board and nominating committee. And so essentially they have pre-screened the candidates for people who are already giving significant amount of money. And so that is another way in which the candidates that appear before the board are those who have already been screened for their ability to give money. These barriers exist for women, but when we asked whether similar or different barriers occur because of race, our interviewees said basically they're the same kinds of barriers. They're who you know, they're the financial issues, and when women of color appear at the bottom, it's because they're really getting hit twice. So they're bearing 2 burdens. We talk a lot here about getting enough women on a board, but I want to just say a couple of things about diversity and inclusion. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase, which has now been enlarged to be diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a really important concept, because once you get on a board, in order to be effective, you have to be included. Corporate boards, you should know, also differ from nonprofit boards in that they are much smaller. The average corporate board is 9 to 11 people. We interviewed people on boards as high as 95 people. That was the top number. But there were many above 50. And there were very, very few that had fewer than 15. So the nonprofit boards are much bigger. And therefore, even if you have 30% women on a nonprofit educational board, if you have 40 or 50 people on that board, generally the board is run by the executive committee, because you can't have 40 or 50 people sitting around the table and having a discussion and making decisions. So it's the executive committee that's making the decisions. And often there aren't any women, or there are only a token few women on the executive committee, so they have no power. We interviewed one woman who was actually in her own right a very powerful woman on a very large board, where she said there was not a single woman who was a committee chair, and there were almost none on the executive committee. So if you're not included in any way, you can't have much impact. And so that becomes a real challenge for diversity and inclusion. So 30% in and of itself doesn't guarantee that you can be effective. That is something that really has to be kept in mind. And I wanted to just mention again about the financial requirement, because I think this is just one of those amazing things that many people were surprised at in our study. We had 2 women on our in our interviewee list who told us that but for their husbands, they would never have gotten on the board, because the board nominating committee approached their husbands first and asked them to be on the board. And the husbands, to their credit, said, you know, my wife is really the much more appropriate person. Either she gives all the money in the family, or she's got the better qualifications. I think in both cases, both things were true. And so they put those women on the boards, and they ended up being extremely successful. One of them actually ended up being the board chair. But it tells you how many barriers there are here, and all of the attitudes that still operate. So I think we'll pause at this point. We've sort of thrown a lot of information at you, and we're really interested to know if you have any reactions or questions at this point. And do we have the poll numbers at this point?
Yes, we do. And Sandy's going to put that up for you. You should see it on your screen now.
So the largest percent of people on this call have not served on a governing board, and that doesn't surprise us. And as Carolyn said, most people don't know the gender and racial makeup. So we have only 11%, and that's not unusual for any group we talk to. We asked about the hospital, and just a few of you know more about your alma mater than you know about the hospital, but essentially most of us don't know. And I certainly didn't know the makeup of the hospital board that I use until I looked because of this research. So you should not feel ashamed, but what we do want to hope you do get curious enough to now do that research and see if you can find out who's on the board of your alma mater. So let's stop and get your questions and comments up to this point. Any surprises in what we've told you? Any questions up to this point?
Vicki, we have one question.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, we have one question, Vicki. And the standard minimum that you commented on, is that a yearly figure?
Yep, that is.
There also is another question, Rhonda. Your research is focused on 57 institutions. Do either of you know how similar the percentage is across the broader country?
These institutions, can I say a word about this? these institutions are institutions that we reached through a process that researchers call snowball sampling. That is, we found women who are on boards who know other women who are on boards, who know other women who are on boards, and so forth. And so we found our respondents for this rather intensive interview. I mean, it was a lengthy interview, and it required a lot of required asking for a lot of confidential information. And of course we promised all of these respondents that they would have anonymity, that their names would not be revealed, nor would the specific institutions be revealed. But I can tell you that it was a sample of both large and small. It was a sample of some of the Ivy League, some of them, I mean, the names of these institutions would be quite familiar to you. These are very prominent institutions across the US.
And can I just add that some of them are in California?
Okay, great. All right, so just a reminder to the audience here that go ahead, and if you have any questions, make sure you enter them in the Q&A. You can find that by hovering near the bottom of your screen and click on that, and you can submit your questions, and we'll reach, when we get to the end, we'll open up and ask your questions. Okay, I think that's it for now on questions.
Okay, Carolyn, it's your turn.
Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so when we asked ourselves why in an increasingly diverse culture and society that surrounds us, why boards are not making very much progress in diversifying their membership. Well, it's clear that an important part of the answer to that question lies in the beliefs and the attitudes of current board members. I made a point of saying earlier in this event today that these nonprofit boards are really truly self-governing. So despite the change that's going on in this culture and in this society and this economy, the board members' own viewpoints, their own attitudes are really the most important influences on the decisions that they make. So this slide shows you some rather discouraging results, I think, from this year's Gallup poll of university and college trustees. This is a poll that is sponsored by the Association of Governing Boards, which you may know is the major national organization for trustees of colleges and universities across the country. And they collaborate with Gallup, and Gallup did for them a survey, and the results were published earlier this year in January of 2020. There were 900 trustees who were polled for this, or 900 respondents, I should say. It was a larger number of those who were polled. And I'd like to direct your attention down to the third and the fourth set of bars on this graph, because what they show you is that less than half the trustees in either public or private universities and colleges think it is very important to increase the diversity of their board by race or by gender. Let me say that again, because I think it's pretty astonishing given the social moment that we're in. Less than half of the trustees, of the 900 trustees who responded to this Gallup survey, think that it's very important to increase the diversity on their boards by race and by gender. And let me just say, by way of explanation, that what this shows you, what this bar graph shows you, is two different bars for the publics and for both public and private trustees. So we could expect perhaps that the trustees in public institutions that are institutions established by legislators for the education of their state residents, that they would feel that it is more important for them to be representing the population of their state. But this was a combination, and the breakdown, I'm not going to go through the whole breakdown with you, but the breakdown does show that the private institutions are even less likely to say that they think this kind of diversity on the board is really an important priority for them. So that's kind of a discouraging finding, at least from our point of view. Can I have the next slide, please? Well, of course, it's our position that all of these trustees really should care about diversity on their board. And it's for several really important reasons. One of the most important sets of reasons here is that it really does improve the governance process. We discovered this in the process of our interviews, that there are some really important ways in which diversity seems to improve the decision-making process and the governing process inside the board. First of all, boards really are only as knowledgeable as the people sitting around the table. So when boards choose to exclude whole categories of people, they're needlessly limiting the talent pool that they draw on. So in order to take really full advantage of a talent pool, they really should be incorporating all of these different groups in the people they bring to the table for board seats. The second reason is that in this post-pandemic world, well, we hope we're going into a post-pandemic world, where we're going to face dramatic changes in enrollment patterns in our colleges and universities, and their boards are going to be facing non-traditional student populations, technology platforms that are rapidly changing in the world of higher education. They're going to have to consider as many new ideas as possible. They really can't afford to be trapped into groupthink here. And we think that boards can avoid that by constructing the most diverse possible group around the table to bring as many viewpoints as possible, and not to get trapped into that likelihood that you're just going to come to agreement around the table for social reasons, for example. And then our research found that women board members want to consider as many possible options before making a decision as they possibly can. And by the way, that means women are very often the most likely to try to bring up the question of the downsides of any action being proposed. What might be the negative consequences or the downside, whereas men really tend more on these boards to drive quickly toward a good enough option. And we heard that from many of the respondents that we polled, including, by the way, some of the men that we interviewed on this. So there's a kind of different approach to decision making. And sometimes the report we heard was sometimes that women want more data, they want more information before they make a decision. And of course, that does sometimes take longer. And it may cause impatience among some of their board colleagues, particularly the men on the board. But women seem to want to be very data informed before moving to a decision. And then finally, we got reports from many of our respondents that women members of these boards just tend to place more value on communication and on collaboration than their male colleagues do. And that process of communicating more fully, making sure that that everybody is heard, that everybody is involved, actually just produces better outcomes in the end, better decision making. So we think all of those are really positive reasons for boards to want to improve the gender balance and also the racial balance on their boards. Next slide, please. And we think that these boards will serve their consumers more effectively with more diverse decision-making. We found, for example, that women board members pay more attention to how their decisions affect people in the institution, people who are their patients or their students, people who are employees of the institution. They're not as focused only on the bottom line as many of their male colleagues are. So for example, our female respondents have recognized, several of them made a point of telling us they recognize that the families of students and patients are important stakeholders who really need to have confidence in the institution, just as the students and or the patients need to have confidence in the institution. That the confidence of the families involved with their patients and their students, that confidence is really important in improving the institution's reputation. So they're more likely to recognize whole families as stakeholders in their operations. Then we thought, we heard some of our respondents tell us that women board members are more likely to take an interest in student life on college campuses. They're likely to be the ones who are going to bring up topics like the campus climate, the safety from harassment, the quality of life, the student services that are being provided to students, so that the student experience as a whole is really not only safe, but a really nurturing student experience for all of the students. And then we also heard that women are more likely to recognize their responsibility as board members to the workforce of the institution, the faculty of the institution, and other employees of the institution, and also for hospitals too, that they expressed concern more frequently about how the decisions that the board makes, how those decisions are going to affect employees, even talking to us about the way that board decisions get communicated to these different stakeholder groups inside the institution. For example, in one instance, one of the interviews that I conducted, a board member, a woman board member, said that she felt that she and her women colleagues were much more conscious of how layoffs get communicated to the workforce in the institution than the male colleagues were. So these are all reasons, it seems to us, why institutions benefit from the participation of women and therefore should seek more women members. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so then we get to the question of what audiences really should care about board diversity. What groups of stakeholders in our society should care about board diversity? And this slide, interestingly, shows you a direct quote from one of our respondents. One of the women we interviewed for this study directly went to the AAUW as soon as we asked the question about what audiences or what stakeholders could we enlist in trying to help us change this pattern of women's underrepresentation. She immediately identified AAUW as a powerful and well-organized force that is supporting higher education across the United States, and therefore an organization that should be involved in this. Now, Vicki has already said that these nonprofit institutions really don't have the kind of stockholders whose activism has pushed for greater diversity on boards in the corporate world. So we need to find the constituencies that have a stake in the success of American higher education. That is really that's our primary goal at this point. Having done the research, we need now to become more active in finding the constituencies that can help us change this pattern. So we're with you here today because we're hoping that AAUW members can become important stakeholders as a group to push our colleges and our universities to include more women and more people of color on their governing boards. So I think I'm going to turn now to Vicki to explain how we think we might be able to do that, how we might act as a kind of constituency as university women to help us accomplish this. So Vicki, can I turn it back to you?
Indeed. And could I have the next slide, please? So this wonderful quote from James Baldwin, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And it seemed very appropriate for what we learned from all these interviewees, that boards are the ultimate group that have to change their own composition because, as Carolyn said, they vote for their own board members. But they have to face that they have a problem in order to begin to change some of their practices so that they recruit a broader pool of candidates, so that they make people feel welcome and included and so on. And our report has a lot of specific recommendations for what boards can do. But the first thing is that they have to pay attention. They have to care about the issue. And the board as a whole should really be discussing this. And certainly the nominating committee should be discussing it. And we have found a correlation between those boards that actually have taken steps to make the change and those boards that have had the full discussion. So how does that take place and how do we get them to that point? Well, the other thing we heard was that leadership is critical. It takes leadership to lead change. So here's where we think as AAUW members, and we also can make a difference because we all have alma maters. So that if you now are curious enough to look at the composition of your board, go to their website, see if you can find who the people are on the board. You could then write a letter to the leadership of the board saying that you're concerned that what you learned is that they're not a great representation of women and or people of color, or that you couldn't find the information at all and that concerns you because how would you even know then how to evaluate it? And you could write to the president of the university, obviously a critical leader on the board. You could write to the chair of the nominating and governance committee, also a critical player in figuring out who are the nominees going to be. You could write to the head of, or at least an officer of the Alumni Association, because we're saying here that alumni should care about this issue. And often alumni are the biggest pool from which people are recruited. And you could write to any of the women on the board if you see that there are women on the board. And we've tried to make this easy for you by actually composing a model letter, which you'll be able to find on your website. And you can certainly write a letter that is completely composed by you, but we just thought it might be helpful to give you a head start and give you a model to use. And then you can, and the letter includes a link to our report. So you can mention our report because it gives 10 concrete recommendations of what boards can do to try to make change. So we're hoping that we can inspire you to want to make these kinds of efforts. We're interested in your reactions and your thoughts on how you think we can inspire stakeholders to try to create change. Some of you, maybe most of you, have a relationship with a hospital or healthcare system as well as with a college or university. And so you might do the same thing for your healthcare institution, because you are a stakeholder if you are a patient or have been a patient or might be a patient at some point. And we're having a harder time figuring out actually how to mobilize stakeholders, because alumni are such an obvious group for eds, but patients are not, how do you find patients? Where is the AAUW for patients? So any ideas you have on either score, we would be very eager to hear your thoughts, as well as your questions and comments. I think we will now open it up for such thoughts, comments, questions, reactions.
The last question we got, I think, is a very interesting one. As you both know and have said, it's not only numbers, but also equity and inclusiveness in committee work and in leadership of committees. There are barriers because of implicit and explicit biases. It means women and women of color will need to have a voice in making changes on boards. How do we make changes from outside, but also from inside?
Well, can I say something about that? I really did. I had one of the most interesting interviews that I conducted was with a male president, institution president, who told me that the women he's had experience with, the women board members with whom he's had experience, have been clearly the most attentive, the hardest workers. They show up more frequently. They take on more assignments when they're asked, and they essentially prove their worth to the boards by working harder than the men do on the board. I mean, he even went so far as to say that he had once looked at attendance patterns on his board and discovered that the few women board members he had were way better at attending way more faithful and likely to attend every meeting where they were supposed to show up than the male board members were. So, I mean, basically his report was women who get on these boards tend to acquit themselves extremely well. They tend to take their responsibilities seriously. And they gain responsibility and they gain leadership that way. And as Vicki reported during this conversation here this evening, we did talk to women who had gained quite a lot of responsibility and power. We talked to women CEOs. We talked to women who had been elevated to some committee assignments, committee chairs, and to chairs of the board. So once they get on these boards, women, as long as they get on these boards in some numbers that give them a kind of license to speak and take full part, once they get on these boards, they actually acquit themselves quite well. I don't know if you would like to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is very important, because we heard over and over again that the women who are on the boards and are given the opportunity to show their talents really do perform. And in terms of your question about how do people get included, we did look a lot at the culture of the board, and those boards that are very top down, often they don't include a lot of men as well as women. So it's a small group that's really running the place. So part of it is pointing out what kind of a culture is going to be good, not only for women and people of color, but for men as well. And often women have an idea of how to create that culture. So we have had women who have become leaders in, for instance, we had a woman tell us that she scheduled her committee meeting. She was chair of a committee, and she deliberately scheduled that at a different time from other committee meetings and invited anybody who was interested to come. And so it really opened it up to others to know what was going on. And then other committees thought that was a brilliant idea. And so people got a lot more engaged in everything that was going on. And so often, you know, from the inside, people can suggest changes to change a culture. We found often the male leaders that we interviewed were very conscious of doing very specific things to put women in leadership positions and to make sure that they got heard. We had women who were either presidents or CEOs who took men aside after the meeting and said, you know, by the way, you know, if you could listen a little bit more and give the woman who was just trying to say something a chance, this would be a better environment. So it takes leadership. It takes people who have the courage to speak out. But in order to care about the issue, I think what we're trying to say is, if the board isn't already doing something about it, it's going to take outside pressure, because people don't change what seems comfortable for them until somebody makes it a little bit uncomfortable for them to keep doing the same old, same old.
Vicki, as you were speaking, I had a thought that I would like to add, because it was eye-opening for me as part of this research. What we discovered when we compared the health institutions that we investigated to the universities and colleges in our survey was that many of the hospitals and healthcare systems deal quite differently with the money issue. That is, the need for donations and contributions from wealthy households. Many of the health institutions have created a second board within their institution, which they call their foundation board. And it is a board that's separate from the governing board of the health system or the hospital. And it's a board with the sole responsibility, with the sole task and responsibility of raising private funds for the institution. And it's a prestigious position within the institution, and members of that board, that foundation board, have full access to the leadership of the institution, and they get invited to events, and they get incorporated into the ongoing life of the institution in very important ways. But their main responsibility is raising money. That means that the governing board can make its choices of incoming board members with much less regard for the question of whether this candidate has enough wealth, enough personal wealth, to be a generous donor to the institution. And I even interviewed one CEO of a major, the major health system in a Midwestern state, who, when I asked him about this question of asking for contributions and maybe making personal wealth and contributions a significant qualification for board membership, he actually expressed indignation that I would have such an idea in my head. He said, and I quote, "Listen, I have a $14 billion operation to run across this state. I can't possibly be putting people on this board just because they have money. They need to be on the board because they bring some kind of talent and knowledge and decision-making authority into the boardroom. So I can't possibly be putting rich people on the board simply because they're wealthy. We have a completely separate board for that." And that was about the most clear, straightforward statement that I got in my portion of the interviewing that shows why these hospitals and health systems have so frequently resorted to putting together a separate board so they don't have to make money such a big part of the qualification for their governing board.
I just wanted
Another
to
question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Another question is, did you contact the WPO organization, Women Presidents of Businesses?
Are you suggesting that they would be a good group to try to inspire to get active on the issue?
that was just a question, but she also goes on to say these women presidents are often on boards, both nonprofit and for-profit.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Yes,
So that would be a good
that
constituency.
would be a good group for us to get in
Mhm.
touch with. Absolutely. It's a good suggestion.
And then another kind of like a wrap-up kind of a question is what is your what's next for you in your research?
Well, can I just say something about that? We are now, we have moved into trying to take some action within our own region to start changing this picture in greater Philadelphia. Once we published our findings for the health systems and the universities within our own region, we started getting some feedback because, quite frankly, the institutions that didn't do well in our survey saw the results and saw themselves at the low end of the ranking system. I myself, the very day that we published our results and that the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is our newspaper of record here in this region, the Philadelphia Inquirer published findings and named the institutions that came in with the smallest percentages of women and people of color on their boards. I got a call from the communications director of the of the university. No, I guess it was a health system. The health system that ranked at the very bottom of health systems, and he proceeded to tell me that we had the numbers wrong that we had used, and so I simply directed him during our phone conversation to his own website and showed him the number of women who were advertised on his own institution's website as the members of his board. And he said, oh, well, but this isn't the right information. This is old information. To which I replied, well, then that's the problem that you have. If people are to know something about your board and who runs the institution and takes responsibility for governing the institution, you really need to be more up to date in circulating accurate information about your board, which he agreed with. He thought that was actually correct. So in many ways, we're trying through our own networks and through contacts with members of these boards to actually change the picture in our own region.
So,
go ahead, Vicki.
So if I may, we have another slide which lists the resources that you can use if you are interested in reading our report or in reading the Philadelphia area report. This slide after this one. Yes, this one. So you'll see how to get to our report on the website. The one on the national one is first. The particular Philadelphia area one is second, the LaSalle University and the Women's Nonprofit Leadership Initiative. And then the third one is an article that was published by Trusteeship Magazine in September as their lead article. That is read by trustees of universities. And so we really were eager to get it there because, as what Carolyn has said might suggest, we didn't do this research because we wanted to put a study on our resume. We are sort of past that in our career trajectory. And we're at this point interested in making change. And so what we wanted was to provide a study that would show why there needs to be change and how change could be brought about. And we hope that you will take a look at the report or at the Trusteeship Magazine shorter article or the executive summary of our report, which is up there. And you will see why this document should be put in front of people who are on these boards so that they themselves can come to the same conclusions. We've done a little follow-up study in the Philadelphia area with some of the institutions that Carolyn is talking about where we're trying to work on pushing change. And we've talked to a number of women on those boards, and we've heard that already these reports have made a difference. Carolyn is mentioning the reaction to the publicity about the LaSalle report and the numbers, but our national report has also been making a difference. One of the women who's an up-and-coming board leader in a healthcare institutions wrote us that she can state quite surely that the report and its visibility was an accelerator and a call to action for her board. And we've had that kind of comment from people in the education world as well as in the healthcare world. So it's a tool. You know, we really want to see it used. We just didn't do it in order to have something published.
The final question that I'm going to be reading is women work on the social fabric of boards, communication, collaboration, connections, etc., which is great. But then women are expected and assigned those roles and are thus not mentored to take on roles in governing committee, in finances, in membership, etc. So though it is great for the boards to have women do these social roles, it is a sword of two edges. How do we maintain these skills that are important for institutions, but also promote women for the other important committees and on boards?
Yeah, well, I understand that. If I do understand the question, it's why do women get certain particular kinds of assignments once they get on governing boards? And those assignments generally do not include the most powerful committees, the executive committees and the nom-gov committees of these boards. And I think Vicki was saying a few moments ago, and I think it's quite true, that there is a degree of there's a process of inclusion that needs to go forward in these boards. And what we have recommended actually to a couple of the board chairs that we've been interviewing and pressing for more action in an inclusionary direction. What we've been recommending is an onboarding process that really does give these new women board members information and access and choices about their participation on the board. And that there be a kind of onboarding process which makes sure they get involved and included, not just in the board activities themselves, but also some of the social activities outside the board. Because in many ways, one standing on boards like this is also dependent on participating in socializing and social activities. One of my interviewees said, I decided I needed to learn how to play golf because there were so many golfers on this board who did some business. It came to my attention that they were doing business at the golf club. So I decided I needed to go out and learn how to play golf. Well, obviously that shouldn't be necessary for women board members to participate fully. But the point that she was making, I think, was that there are not only these kinds of formal roles within the boardroom, but there are also there are collaborations that occur outside the boardroom. There are informal lines of communication that women need to make sure they get included in. And frankly, one of my interviewees, one of the women I interviewed, said, if I were just to make one statement to my women colleagues about how they should behave on these boards and in this world of governance, it would be women need to network at least as much with men as they network with other women. And
sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'd like to add also to that, and I think the Finance Committee is a good example of this, because often women don't get put on the Finance Committee, and that's a very powerful committee, as well as the Governance Committee. Women have to be willing to ask, and we have had feedback from numerous people we interviewed that in order to get certain positions, you need to speak up and make it clear you want those positions. You want to be on that committee. Now, one thing that would help with that is, and this is one of our recommendations, that when boards are recruiting, They do a skills analysis and a skills matrix that looks at the skills they have on their board and the skills they need. And they identify, do they need people in finance? Do they need people with human resources? Do they need people with technology experience? And then when they go out and recruit, even though they're making a special effort to recruit women and people of color, they're looking for people with those specific skills. And so when they're brought onto the board recognizes that they're there, not just because they found any woman wandering the streets and decided to bring her onto the board, but they brought her on because she has certain skills. And that makes a profound difference.
Okay, I have a couple additional questions where you've got about 7 minutes to go. Have either of your reports had any impact so far?
Oh, well, I think maybe Vicki has already said to you, but I think it's worth reiterating that nationally, this study that we did was featured as the lead article in Trusteeship magazine for September 2020. So last month, we were the lead and the magazine cover article, drawing people in from the world of trustees to read a kind of condensed version of this study. We started the study well before the kind of coming together of the Black Lives Matter moment in the United States and the recognition of tremendous inequality in our society. But we think that this moment in across the United States, in our culture, has actually increased the chances that people will be willing to pay attention to this issue, because this kind of a power position within some of the most important institutions in our society, and institutions that are right at the center of the whole discussion these days, healthcare and higher education are really in the center of discussions about social inequality in U.S. culture and in our economy and in our society. And so partly I think as a matter of accident, we have put this study forward in a moment in the United States when it's most likely to get some attention paid to it. So we're hoping we can benefit from that.
And to add to Carolyn's comment about Trusteeship magazine, we've had feedback now from several women we know on boards that their entire board has been given that magazine. And so they will see that article, and that will be a way to introduce the subject into discussion. So again, it's a tool that will be used, and it's back to the nothing that can be changed until it is faced. So this will, we hope, require boards to face it.
Yeah, very good. I think you did answer this question I have. It says, do you think now is the right time to be pushing board gender diversity, considering both the pandemic and focus on racial disparities, particularly with Black Lives Matter?
Well, I think the answer is we really did talk among ourselves in this Philadelphia group. We quite seriously debated whether we should try to move forward, accelerate our work now, or whether we should try to hold back. And we decided to push forward. And I think we have decided as a group that was really the right decision, because this kind of moment has all of the challenges that we're facing have only exacerbated the kinds of social divisions that people are uncovering and discovering and discussing, and that need attention, serious attention. And so we're actually glad that we chose to push forward now in this moment.
Yes, I would agree with that too. Sandy, can you put the webinar slide up? I just wanted to say that at the end of our, we're at the end of our presentation, but we will also be posting any additional information regarding the Q&A that we've gone through today on our website, exactly where you went to go register for it. Just wanted to mention briefly our upcoming webinars. We have our second AUW Funds Meet the Fellows. It's another set of fellows that will be at this presentation that were there before. So keep that in mind. On October 24th. On the 28th, our webinar is Why Public Policy Matters. And on October 29th is Keeping in Touch with Your Tech Trekkers and Why You Should. So if you're interested in any of these webinars or any other, looking at any other future ones, go to our website at www.auw.california or -california.ca.org. And on the top menu, you'll see 2020 to 2021 webinars. Click on that and you'll see all the information on the following page. With that in mind, I think Diane has a few comments to make and we're ready to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Carolyn and Vicki, for being with us tonight. And I know it's getting later tonight than it is out here in California. So it really is night for you. I don't know about, you just opened up my eyes to a lot of things that I hadn't really thought about too much until we got involved with this webinar. So we have a lot of work to do, don't we?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. And, we can legislate a lot of things. We can work with our legislatures and our senators. In fact, the senator that did all the work in California to help us get more people on public boards or on governing boards, she is actually my senator, so I'm really proud of her. But she is termed out now, Senator Hannah Beth Jackson. So she's termed out now, but we'll find another Hannah Beth Jackson to help us as we move forward. But this is definitely something that AUW needs to look at because that is our interest, to get more women in positions of power and to change the world. So thank you so much for volunteering to come, and we really, really do appreciate it. And we'll stay in touch.